Hi, everyone. Welcome back. I know there's a couple more people who might be trickling in, but just in the interest of time, I wanted to get started. Welcome back to our spring seminar series. Today, we're so excited to have David Vidal with us. He joined Mayo Clinic in 2020. He's an attorney and the vice chair for software as a medical device as a medical device regulation in Mayo Clinic's Center for Digital Health, Data, and Analytics Leadership. His team is leading the development of enterprise-wide infrastructure to enable safe, effective, and ethical realization of FDA-regulated artificial intelligence and software solutions. David specializes in navigating product regulatory strategy and design controls for AI and software-based product teams. He also advises on SAMD compliance, federal regulations, and standards for AI and software frameworks. He previously held the position of General Counsel and Senior VP for Quality Assurance and Regulatory Affairs at IDx Technologies, where he played an instrumental role in the FDA authorization and deployment of IDx-DR, the first autonomous AI diagnostic cleared by the FDA. So we're really excited to have him with us today and also provide a kind of different perspective than we sometimes get when we think about informatics work. David, I'll hand it to you. Thank you so much.
Great. Pleasure to be here. Go ahead and share my slides. Make sure I can see everybody. Okay, you can all see that?
Yeah, looks great.
Awesome. I prefer informality, so I'll just stage that from the beginning. As I go through this, if there's any questions, feel free to pop them into the chat, and if I miss anything, Pooja's gonna poke me, flag me for that. But yeah, pleasure to be here. I really focus mostly on the regulation of software and AI, but actually our team has expanded quite significantly in Mayo Clinic. We now have about 65 people in this AI enablement function at Mayo Clinic, and it's expanded beyond regulatory and quality, and now includes AI science and translational science and so forth. So you are my people. This is a great group to be with. Happy to be here. But I will focus mostly on the regulatory aspects, as that's most of my background here. I don't have any relevant disclosures just for this presentation. And of course, I have to, being a lawyer, make sure that it's clear that this is not legal advice, and to make sure you consult your own independent counsel or review board for any specifics. But today, really what I want to focus on is four things. First of all, I'm going to spend a little bit of time helping you navigate whether or not your AI or your software solution is subject to the FDA. I'll probably spend a good amount of time on that, as it's a kind of a threshold critical issue in deciding what kind of controls you need to have. And then I want to move into, okay, if you are regulated by the FDA, what should you expect? Or what either can you expect from vendors that are subject to the FDA, or if you yourself have a tool that's subject to the FDA, what should you expect when you're going through the FDA process? And then part three, I'm going to touch on, although this is very much of an evolving space, if you're not subject to the FDA regulations, what should you still expect in terms of accountability, given the current regulatory landscape? And then finally, if we have time, I'll do at least one quick point regarding liability and accountability for AI in healthcare. But first, just to make sure that we've got this established, it's in my title, but I realize that some folks are not familiar with even the term. So software as a medical device is really two things. One, it's software that meets the definition of a medical device. So it's intended for the use in the diagnosis, prevention, cure, mitigation, treatment, or prevention of disease. So that's part of the definition. And then the other piece is software as a medical device is inherently able to operate as a standalone function, which is distinguished from software in a medical device, which really drives a piece of hardware. Software as a medical device really can make its own sort of a clinical decision or clinical function. So examples of that might be software AI that looks at an image of a mole and helps determine whether there's a melanoma in that image, or software that detects abnormalities in an EKG. So really, it can it's a standalone function, would be software as a medical device. And why is it important to have this distinguishing term of software as a medical device, which is something that's not software as a medical device, is really really critical in understanding what are you obligated to do if you yourself are building, or what can you expect of vendors that are building AI or software solutions from the FDA. And this is kind of a sliding scale of what you can expect from the FDA, and it's all based on risk. So if you look down here at the green, the stuff that's not a medical device or software or AI that meets their criteria for enforcement discretion, the green here, you don't even have to submit or do anything with the FDA. So it's quite a bit less FDA rigor that you would expect out of those products. But as you get into the yellow, class 1 and above, you're talking about things that are by definition software as a medical device and will require some FDA rigor, which we'll go into in a moment. Class 1 typically requires FDA registration, but typically you do not have to submit for FDA review and clearance or approval prior to releasing the market. But when you get into the class 2, that's where you start to have obligations to submit to the FDA for their review or approval before you go to market. So really critical to know the definitions and the categories of where you stand to know how much rigor you should expect from the FDA. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time helping make that distinction. Are you subject to FDA or not? And this is kind of a simplified diagram that we use internally. And by the way, we have a group internally called the Software as a Medical Device Review Board, which operates very much like an IRB for software and AI products. And we actually go through this rubric to help all of the innovators across Mayo Clinic determine, are you subject to FDA jurisdiction or not? And the way we do it first is, again, start with that definition. Are you intended for the use in the diagnosis, cure, mitigation, treatment, or prevention of a disease or condition? If the answer is no, you're automatically not subject to the FDA under medical device regulations. These are things like if it's just a educational tool or a research tool or a billing tool, right? You're not even intending for clinical care. You'd be outside of the definition. But if the answer is yes, and FDA is very purposely broad in their definition to make sure that they capture all the things that could potentially carry clinical risk, then we move to the next two elements of these of our decision making, which is, okay, if you do meet the definition of a medical device, are you eligible under any of FDA's exempt criteria to make it so that you're not likely regulated by the FDA? And I'm actually going to walk through each of these in subsequent slides just to help give an understanding and some examples of what might fit into these criteria, especially this confusing one of clinical decision support. Because clinical decision support, unfortunately for confusion reasons, can be either non-device clinical decision support or device clinical decision support. So I want to walk through that criteria and what it means to be neither one. So let's walk through that. This is just a different view of the previous slide. We have a very large category of digital health technologies, which from a regulatory perspective, we break up into two: either our medical device functions, which would be subject to the FDA, or our non-medical device functions. And in the next slides, I'm going to kind of walk through each of these: administrative, electronic health record, general health and wellness, medical device data systems, and then spend a little more time on this last one, clinical decision support. By the way, most of the innovators that come to us are trying to fit the green criteria. So that's the reason why we spend so much time on the analysis, because they're trying to say, hey, I don't have the money or the team or the capacity to adhere to all the FDA regulations. Can you help scope my product to make sure that I'm not falling under the FDA? So that's why we would walk through these. Okay, so of the non-medical device categories. So first of all, we have our administrative functions. So FDA is very much about like, okay, what are you intending to do with that software? And with that, you write this intended use. And if that intended use really is administrative in nature, even if it falls into that general bucket of we're trying to, cure, mitigate, or prevent disease or condition, if it really is administrative in nature, like scheduling or billing, it would fall into this exempt category. And FDA has more definition to that, but generally, it's fairly straightforward to be able to identify software that falls into this administrative function as an exemption. Next up, we have an exemption for the electronic health record itself, right? This is Cerner or Epic. and really something that's intended to operate as an electronic health record is not subject to FDA medical device regulation. However, it is subject to other regulations, which we might get into a little bit later, like rules from the from ONC, the Office of the National Coordinator. A really, really important point to make about this one, though, is that you can have a software as a medical device function living or existing inside of the electronic health record. And in fact, that's quite common. So for example, that example I gave earlier, an EKG, an algorithm that looks at an EKG and identifies early signs of disease, that may fully operate and function within Epic. But it could, the function itself, the EKG software as a medical device tool, would be subject to the FDA, even if the electronic health record itself as a whole is not subject to the FDA. So I know we get a lot of confusion. I think some physicians come to us and they say, well, I'm in the electronic health record, so I should be exempt, right? But really, that's not the case. FDA is going to take a very modular approach and look at it function by function. The next category that's exempt from FDA jurisdiction and regulation is a really broad category called general health and wellness. And these would be the majority of the things on our Apple Watches or our smartwatches or smartphones. Weight management, diet tracking, really kind of those broad categories that are related to your health, related to wellness, but really generic in nature. Considered by the FDA to be very low risk, usually not disease specific. Usually, if they are disease specific, they're related to very well understood categories of disease. Like if it relates to diabetes, it would still just be for like nutrition and exercise to help your diabetes, which is not controversial, right? It wouldn't be like the A1C tracker, right? It would be more of a generic thing under general health and wellness. And then we have our medical device data systems, or MDDS. These are like the pipelines of data transfer. They may be directly related to data transfer from a medical device to another medical device, but the pipeline itself is exempt. This is FDA's way of saying we got to make sure that the category of medical device isn't so broad that it encompasses everything that even relates to clinical care. So they've accepted this as a category, data transfer essentially. And then we get to the sticky one, our clinical decision support products. And as I stated earlier, these are products that they relate to helping physicians and clinical staff make decisions, but they are a little tricky in that they could fall into one of two categories. They can be non-device clinical decision support or device clinical decision support. And I'll go into what that means. In order to be non-device clinical decision support, and if you get a little lost, stop me, because sometimes it's confusing because they have some double negatives going on here. In order to be non-device clinical decision support, in other words, in order to not be regulated by the FDA with a clinical decision support function, you need to meet all four criteria. Criteria one is that it is not intended to process or analyze medical images, signals, or patterns. If you look at the number of, or you look at the departments or the specialties that most of the FDA clearances come from, it's radiology, cardiology, digital pathology, some ophthalmology. It's primarily because of this. If the algorithm or the AI is analyzing images like in radiology, it's likely to be subject to FDA jurisdiction. So we get those specialties submitting a lot more things to the FDA. So they dominate the FDA clearances by not meeting this criteria. Criteria two is that it is intended for the purpose of displaying or printing medical information about a patient. This is it sounds really straightforward, like, oh, sure, everything's medical information. We should be able to meet this criteria really easily. But the FDA has added in their guidance document a little bit of nuance to that. And really what they're thinking when they say medical information is really kind of the standard things you'd see in the electronic health record. And they give this example, the standard things that a physician to physician interaction in a hallway may communicate, right? Blood pressure, heart rate, those kinds of like basic things. What would not qualify in here, however, is those, like, it took us 1.5 million data points in order to find this one nuanced thing in their data, in that patient data. They would say is not any longer medical information. That's more like an insight or something that is more nuanced than the typical medical information that they're referring to or talking about when they talk about meeting this criteria. Still a lot of things pass this criteria, right? A lot of things in the electronic health record that would qualify, but they would not scope it in. They would not scope in like, again, like genomic information that pulls out one very, very specific or nuanced point that might not be yet fully validated or realized. Okay, that's criteria 2. Criteria 3, which you would have to meet if you want to be not regulated by the FDA, is that it's intended for the purpose of supporting or providing recommendations to a healthcare professional. Again, sounds so easy. Yeah, we're going to like easily meet this criteria, but the FDA guidance provides a lot more nuance to that, primarily in making sure that it is truly being supportive and providing recommendations, as opposed to being relied upon or creating some sort of automation bias for the physicians or the healthcare staff. And a couple examples of things that the FDA pulls out as being no longer supporting, but actually biasing clinical care. One would be if it has a singular and specific output, right? So if the AI processes, healthcare information, and then it says they have a 92% chance of pancreatic cancer based off of what we're seeing, and that's the output, that would have the tendency to bias care, right? Because no healthcare staff or physician is going to look at that and say like, oh, I'm going to actually override that. I'm going to make it. They're going to be a lot more scared and likely more be inclined to go with that recommendation versus something that's more broad, something that's more like a differential based off of the information we see. Here's the five different diseases or conditions that you might want to watch out for, right? That requires more independent clinical judgment and more likely would be supportive as opposed to more driving clinical care. And another example the FDA gives to help distinguish what would or would not meet this criteria would be something that would be time critical. And the example they use in their guidance is sepsis, the sepsis algorithm. So if you have an algorithm that's detecting signs or risk of sepsis, and that produces an output for a physician, sepsis is a really urgent situation that somebody would want to take care of. So if the result is, yeah, this is likely sepsis, the physician is more likely to act really quickly without taking the time to independently validate or make their own independent judgment about whether the algorithm was right or wrong. So again, it's less supportive and more like a dictating or driving clinical care. So those are the two examples FDA gives in this third criteria. And then finally, we have our fourth criteria, which is that, and it sounds really similar to the third in some ways, but that the healthcare provider or professional is able to independently review the recommendations so as not to rely on the primary, not to rely primarily on the recommendations that are coming from the algorithm. A lot of overlap with category 3, but actually this has kind of evolved to be a lot more about transparency. So within this category, when we're advising folks with the Mayo Clinic, we would say in order to meet this category, you need to provide the information with the result that allows the physicians to make independent judgment, right? What were the inputs? What were the outputs? What was the type of calculation that underpinned the result, right? How does this align to the clinical standard of care? We would provide that information again so that physicians and healthcare staff could provide their own independent judgment over top of the result. I'm going to take a pause here because this is a little bit of a tricky category and see if there's any questions related to this clinical decision support, where to fall one side or the other, non-device or device. Don't see anything in the chat either. Okay, stop me anytime.
I'm sorry, could I just to probe a bit more to make sure I'm fully clear on this. So for number one, you're using the example of imaging. If we put imaging aside and perhaps focus on all of the non-imaging data science work that our department does, if I understand correctly, you're saying any pattern analysis, that's generating an output, it would not meet this criteria, and therefore it would be an FDA regulated. Because you have to meet right, the double negative we're dealing with here, right?
Yeah.
You have to meet all of these criteria. And so just any sort of pattern analysis of clinical data, even, imaging aside, would rule you into FDA regulated.
That's a correct statement on the letter of what they've written. And actually, these are words from Congress that FDA is now guiding on. So this is literally taken directly from the 21st Century Cures Act. But I'll challenge my blanket answer by saying what's a pattern, right? And so we are literally like actively helping and trying to define using precedent what is a pattern, what's not a pattern. Okay. Certainly, I can understand that a pattern would be like, okay, let's take that EKG example. Actually, EKG is bad because it's a signal. A repeat predictable sample that is taken over and over and over and compares new sample to older samples and watches for trends up or down, more like monitoring. That's more like a pattern, right? You can imagine that to be a little higher risk, but like a repeat sample that's each taken independently. Maybe it's like, oh, is this patient eligible for screening yet? Now, nope. 6 months from now, yeah, no, yes, no. 6 months from now, yes, no. More likely not a pattern in my non-legal advice opinion. So that we have to kind of like take on a little risk in figuring out, well, what's FDA really looking for here? They're looking for the higher risk stuff. And do we meet that criteria or not?
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, of course. Great question. And that's what we're finding out. This is, I mean, time is flying, but this all came out, their final guidance in October 2022. We're still like, there's still a bunch of sepsis algorithms out there that are not cleared by the FDA, right? Like, how are we interpreting? What are they interpreting? Like, there's nuance to all of this that will eventually kind of work itself out. But I wanted to prepare you at least like with a high level. Ooh, we have a question. What about epidemiologic or surveillance data, such as defining healthcare acquired infections for the purpose of reporting? Yeah, back to for that question in the chat, back to again, I think intended use. Is it really population data, population like an understanding of the whole population that may lead to some clinical decisions, or is it like a very patient specific driving that medical decision making for that one patient? That would be one kind of threshold issue that I say. If it's more population data, I would say it's more likely not a medical device. It's not driving any individual's care versus a decision making for one individual patient. But I want to make sure I understood the question correctly. Did that sort of answer the question? If you want to elaborate, or is there more to that question that I didn't interpret? Okay, I'll assume that it's close enough. But here's kind of a high level takeaway. If you're trying to be non-device, oh yes, must report infection. Yeah. Reporting data, right? So if it's intended for the purpose of reporting, like identifying and reporting, to me that's more administrative, right? Than actually driving clinical care. So non-device AI or clinical decision support would not interfere with medical images, signals, or patterns. It would not provide a singular specific disease output, and it would not be used in a time-critical healthcare scenario. And generally, it would use information from the electronic health record, align to, or you could show that it's really just facilitating or enacting already existing clinical practice patterns, preferred practice, and it's explainable and transparent to the physician. Okay. What if your product is a medical device? So we spent so far the whole first part on the green side. What if you're on the blue side and you're a medical device? Typically, what we would do in our team for our internal innovators is identify a regulatory strategy, enact design controls, which I'll show quickly here in a moment, and then ensure that we have a quality management system in place. So it kind of moves into part two. Now we know we're regulated. We believe we're regulated. What do we do? And this is a really kind of high level way in which we would go about working through the process of getting to deployment for a regulated solution. And we do this, actually, this is a little bit of strategy, the way that we do this. is we sort of have this early category of research and defining regulation or defining strategy and ensuring that we are starting on our best AI practices or good machine learning practices, because this is a pretty, this is a less regulated space right now. IRB certainly has plenty of regulations for human subject protection, but in terms of design controls, in terms of like what they would expect of you from the build of those products, it's fairly light touch at this point, right? You're going to have a lot of obligations later on, but we want our internal innovators to still have a lot of freedom and flexibility to try, test things, see if it works. You know, are these weights the right one? Do I have the right data size sample? Do I have the right patient population and training my algorithm? Really, lots of iteration at these early stages without the heavy-handed formality of having formal documentation. We'd like to make sure that that's happening at the early stages to promote innovation, and also to get to a point where we actually are ready to invest on everything from here forward, which would be the more formalized FDA process, which would include at a really, really high level product development activities, which I'll go into in a moment, risk management activities, product testing, and then of course our obligations post-deployment for maintaining, monitoring, auditing, and changing those products. These three categories are here. Are in FDA's language called design controls. It's one section, 21 CFR 820.30, cover this whole bucket. And then beyond that, we have bigger obligations for quality management system regulations, which are really everything for here forward. So really just quickly, I just want to highlight here just some resources. I'm sure this team knows plenty about these. What are good machine learning practices? What are the best practices for building AI at that early stage? FDA now is asking questions about that, and actually that the level of sophistication in the FDA review process is becoming more and more sophisticated. So teams have to be much more prepared to speak to many things related to how they actually built the AI portion, not just the software wrapper around the AI. This is one example. A collaboration that FDA defined these categories. These are really high level. It's AI or good machine learning practices 101 essentially. So there's not a whole lot of like actionable things, but at least that it gives you a little bit of an indication of the types of questions that they're going to ask, or they'll ask more detailed questions to get to understanding these categories. But last year, or maybe it was even more recent than last year, FDA came out with another guidance regarding the predetermined change control plans. And I have a link in the appendix. The context of this guidance was really about what can be done post-market, so post-deployment. So after you go through the FDA, FDA has provided the opportunity for you to have really a free agreement with the FDA to make changes without having to go back to the FDA. Really advanced guidance document for the FDA. Their intent is to make sure that they're accommodating what AI can do when it's more iterative, right? So they're making sure that rather than having 6 months or 12 months release cycles like you might for a hardware device, that you can iterate much more quickly post-market with controls in place. So they have a whole guidance document that defines those controls, which I can certainly answer questions on, but don't know if I have time to go into the whole thing. But I want to highlight, though, that if you look at Appendix A of this guidance document, when they're talking about the modification protocol, they actually do a really good job of defining the questions that they would ask to understand what is best AI practices or good machine learning practices. I think it's got like 4 or 5 pages of questions related to data management practices, retraining practices, which you can use to understand what they're expecting for training practices, how performance evaluation, how you're going to evaluate your AI for things like bias and drift, and then update procedures, which would be making sure that you have the right communication out to the folks that are using that algorithm, so that they understand what changes were made and how that impacts the use of it. Really, really valuable. So Appendix A of this guidance document is a much better version of defining what FDA is looking for AI best practices than this sort of high-level overview. So I'm going to flag that for you. And again, happy to answer questions. I'll keep, okay, that's nothing in the chat. But I want to move on into the next category. So what should we expect if we move beyond, we have the algorithm we like the performance, we really want to move into this to the stage of saying, okay, this is an algorithm we like, but we want to also call it productize this algorithm, right? We want to make it ready for the FDA, or we want to make it ready for clinical deployment. That would be starting to execute on design controls. And again, before you even start design controls, what FDA would expect for design controls, you'd want to make sure that you've already got your IRB protocols in place and human subject protections in place in order to actually use the data and test your algorithm. We just talked about good machine learning practices or AI best practices. You want to make sure that you've already complied with those, right? You don't want to have an AI or a machine learning product that you want to start putting all these expensive controls in place and then realize the FDA is going to ask you a question about your training data. And if you don't have like an adequate sample size, you would have wasted a lot of time. So you want to make sure that all that stuff from that Appendix A that I described was at least accounted for. And then I don't have time to touch on it today, but ensuring you have the right data privacy and security practices in place. You might as well have that before you get going, and realizing that you don't have that later is a problem. But I'm going to spend the next slides really talking about just this. So this is sort of our simplified, quote unquote, diagram of a really complex topic, defining everything that the FDA would expect for design controls. And that would be actually design controls and quality management system regulation. So I'm going to walk through these steps on the next slide. So they want evidence of, and I should say, I will repeat, evidence. They want things documented, right? That's the way that they can audit you. That's the way they can understand how you build your product. So they're going to look for documentation. They're going to look for documentation that you have design planning. They're going to look for design inputs, right? This is understanding, gathering the requirements, the user needs, the software requirements. This is your benchmark. This is the thing you're going to be testing yourself against, requirements. They're going to look for design outputs. Like after you built it, is it meeting the needs of what your design inputs dictated you needed? They're going to look for verification, which I'll go into in a moment. Validation, transfer, meaning how you're going to actually move this tool into clinical practice. How you're going to integrate it into clinical workflows and into IT systems. And then, of course, they're going to look for our post-deployment operations to make sure we're getting the right feedback and understanding the product, which will feed right back into new plans, because you're going to learn things in the field. All of these are at the core really part of your overall quality management system, which includes more procedures. And on this outer ring here, FDA is looking for accountability. So they literally want like names, roles, responsibilities, management, identified management to make sure that these products are working and continuing to work as intended. That's a lot, right? Like knowing that somebody's gone through the FDA, they have evidence of all of these things. And you as a user can ask for these things, or at least they're probably not going to give them to you for confidentiality reasons, but at least you can ask, like, how did they achieve certain aspects of this? So I'll walk through it a little bit. Again, just on that early stage, design inputs, identifying user needs, identifying the system and the product requirements, and identifying the software requirements. These things they expect each to be written down, right? Because you're going to be eventually you're going to be testing yourself against these and making sure that you align to them and that you validated that each of these are in place. There's an art to this too. I'm not the best expert for the art, but you need to write requirements in a way that are that you can measure and that are achievable, right? So you can't have such a broad requirement that you can never test it, and you can't have such a narrow requirement. You're going to have thousands of requirements that you need to meet. There's a really kind of a balance in the middle. And the other piece, which I'll go into here in the next slide, is making sure that you start at the early stages your risk management processes, which is going to include findings from your risk management processes that will actually become part of your requirements. So we'll go into that for a second in the second bucket. So risk management is defined very well in standards. I'll allude to this in a moment, but risk management, I think, is something that is often identified as a need for AI, but very few people actually have like an example of how to go about doing that. I would argue that it's already there in the FDA regulations and in the standards. There's already a model out there for how we can manage risks of software products and AI. And I'm going to make a prediction that I believe coming here in the future with new regulations and executive orders and so forth, that we are going to see a lot more formalized risk management, which is probably going to look something like the risk management processes that are already in place or that are expected by the FDA. And at a high level, what the terms that we would use for formal risk management would be a hazard. So the example we give is as a hazard could be a shark, just a shark out in the ocean. Harm is another term that would be used, and harm would be, for example, in the same analogy, losing an arm to that shark, right? That's the harm that occurred based off of the hazard. And risk, the way the risk is identified in formal risk management is how harmful, also the severity, which would be how harmful is it to lose that arm, multiplied by likelihood. How likely is it that I'm going to lose an arm? So risk is actually a calculation, severity times the likelihood of that harm. And we do this over and over and over on the things that we identify as hazards. So I'll go into an example after this, but those are sort of the terms we use. But what they'll result in is when we identify risks, we move into, okay, how are we going to mitigate those risks? What are the risk mitigation activities that we're going to do that will, again, feed right back into requirements? They're going to, if we identify something that we need in place to mitigate a risk, we're going to have to turn that into a requirement that then we test to make sure. So examples of different risk mitigation activities would be inherent safety by design would be the best one. An example of that would be a shark-proof swimming area, right? So we literally have a fence so that we know that a shark can't get into that area. That would be inherent safety by design. We've actually designed a protective barrier. The second to that, not quite as good, but still pretty good, are protective measures, right? So regulation processes, right? No bait fishing near the swimming area, right? We pull sharks away as a means to mitigate risks. And then finally, the least effective, but still heavily utilized and valuable still, but not quite as effective, is the information, right? Providing information and training. That would be like putting a sign on the beach that says, warning, there's sharks here, right? People might go there, but it doesn't necessarily prevent the sharks from getting into it. So that's all terminology, but maybe we walk through it with an example. So an example of risk management that we might do for AI. First, let's identify the hazard, right? A really well-known hazard, incorrect output or bias. That's actually, it's an incorrect output that leads to bias. So let's say that's the hazard, that's the shark in this example. And by the way, our risk files are long, right? Well, line by line of all the potential hazards that we've identified for that particular situation. Okay. So this hazard, okay, well, then we think next, all right, what is the potential situation that might lead to this hazard? Well, for this product, let's say we decide that, or we identify that the patient is being processed by the algorithm, but that patient, that demographic of that patient was not in the training set. So we actually don't know that it works for that individual patient, that cohort of patients, which is the reason it led to bias, right? Because we provided a recommendation that the algorithm was never trained in order to provide. Let's say we identify that as the situation that leads to that hazard. And the harm could be incorrect diagnosis, which could be significant. So let's say, again, probability times severity. That's the way we would identify risk. Let's just say that our calculations come out to say that, and this is all predefined, so there's a lot more to it, but what's the probability that will happen? Let's say it's a 4 initially. What's the severity? Well, incorrect diagnosis based, that's leads to bias. That's a 5 right now. So this would be like kind of the left side of our risk management column. And then we need to be able to say, okay, well, how are we going to make this acceptable? This is the initial risk is red. It's unacceptable. And this might be the way we go about doing it. Let's say we identify 2 controls. One control would be we actually, let's see. Before we run the algorithm on that patient, we actually have another algorithm that identifies whether that patient cohort, whether the population that patient belongs to was in the validation set. Maybe we just run that algorithm before we even use it or make that patient applicable to it. So maybe that's like a inherent safety by design, right? It won't even be used on a patient that it potentially could be biased on. And then let's say that we also provide the last risk mitigation one, the warning sign. And we also give training and information to the users of these algorithms to make sure that they really understand the data sets that went into training and validating, so that they can themselves assess whether that algorithm would be good for that patient. And then let's just say in the criteria that we use, we've lowered that probability to a 2, still potentially a high severity of harm, but it's so low risk that we've identified it as acceptable. This would go into our report, and we'd say, okay, we've mitigated risks of bias for this particular table. And I spent a lot of time walking through that, but I think it's really important, and I really do think that it's going to be risk management in general. We're going to see more and more of, and I think that this way of doing it, given that it's already well understood and used by regulators, is likely going to be at least partially the direction that we're all going. And I mentioned earlier about like these really big long tables. We would have these long tables for identifying, mitigating risks, but these tables are expansive and huge. If anybody's ever seen what a traceability matrix might look like for a medical device function, it traces all of these things, right? So if we've identified product requirements or software requirements or risks, we want to make sure that we've both identified in the table and that we've verified and validate that they pass. These are all traceable back and forth. I'm an auditor sometimes of these tools, and the favorite thing to do, not my favorite thing, but the favorite thing of some auditors is to actually go in here and say, okay, let's pick this software requirement and let's go trace it back and forth to determine whether it was actually accounted for in the product. All right, then we move on to verification and validation. Verification really is testing, more like software testing. Did the team build the product right? So if we have a requirement, and we wrote software code to meet that requirement, did it pass, right? Sometimes that's automated testing, and sometimes that's other types of testing, but it's really about more like software testing. Versus validation is asking the question, did we build the right product? Does it actually work in the setting where it's intended to be used? And that's where we get into more things like silent evaluation or clinical testing in the actual intended workflow, as opposed to just sort of the software testing to make sure that the requirements are met. Validation also comes in many different forms. So typically these would all be lumped together into one protocol. But the validation will include software validation, right? Making sure it actually functionally works in its intended setting the way it's supposed to work. Usability evaluation to ensure that those who are actually intending to use the product understand it, right? Like can actually guide their way through it and make sure that they get the right results. And then clinical evaluation, which might be sensitivity, specificity, or some identification of whether it's actually aligned to the standards, the clinical standards. Okay, then we move over to the second to last, which was design transfer. I described that as like, okay, we built the product, we tested it, we like it, but how do we actually move that into clinical practice? That includes a variety of things, including making sure that there's manuals and instructions for people to use, system level requirements, so not just the product level, but system level, like does it work only on a certain type of hardware or platform, or do we need to make sure that the IT systems are set up in a certain way to make it work? Of course, we have security, we have our continuous maintenance plans, system maintenance plans, and then we actually have to test these as well. So part of the testing that we would submit to the FDA would be to make sure that we can actually take this product and transfer it into clinical practice. And then lastly, we have our post-appointment. So these are mostly grouped under the category of quality management systems regulation. So less about, although related to design controls. And that would be formal systems to make sure that we have feedback, maintenance, audits, what we know how to handle and what to do if we identify a product that's not working, and then we have actions to make sure that we're adapting to the regulations. So again, if you're a user of products, these would be the things, some of the primary things that I would ask the vendor. What are you doing for this, right? What are you doing? What's my obligation? What's your obligation? And if you're the builder, this comes into play once you go into clinical practice. So you want to make sure that you have systems in place. Okay. That's my overview of the regulated process, this whole thing. And I'm going to now move into just a couple really quick points on non-regulated practices, but I want to stop and see if anybody has any questions regarding kind of the like step through of what FDA would expect for documentation going into submission. Okay, great. It pause at any moment as well. Okay. But what if you're not subject to the FDA regulations? And this is a real evolving area as well. I think even 2 years ago, folks that would have come to us and said, am I subject to the FDA? We would walk through pretty much everything that we've already done in this presentation so far. And if they didn't meet it, they'd be like, whew, like I don't meet FDA regulations. I can do it the way I want to do it. They would have been a little more justified in feeling that way 2-3 years ago. But now there's actually quite a bit more forming from the federal side that we're now alerting people to be aware of, and that I think having good knowledge of like what the FDA expects of practices and building AI and software solutions, you have a good understanding of FDA. I think you're going to have a good understanding of where all regulation is going. And I'll just give two quick examples. One would be the White House level. So between this White House blueprint on AI and the White House executive order on AI, AI broadly, even outside of healthcare, they're starting to call for and use the same terms that we would be using in the regulated world, like establishing principles for performance, transparency, accountability. All throughout these, you'll see the word safety, efficacy, and these are going to eventually soon be imposed on all vendors of AI, and vendors even outside of healthcare are going to be asking themselves, how do I prove safety? How do I prove transparency? How do I prove? And I would advise to go right back to those same principles. Well, how does the FDA look at that? And so even for our non-regulated products, we're still anticipating and rightfully expecting it to be quite a bit less burdensome in terms of the processes we're following. But we want to potentially take advantage of some of the already existing processes for safety, efficacy, ethics, in order to show compliance to things like the forthcoming executive order on AI. And another one that comes up quite a bit is the Federal Trade Commission. The FTC is quite action oriented with AI. They've actually come out with quite a few things, and really their mandate as a federal agency is about protecting consumers. And so one of their main focuses is really claims substantiation, right? So they've actually taken action against AI companies that have gone too far in their claims. One in particular was an app that you took a picture of a mole and it would tell you whether or not you had skin cancer or whether you're at risk of skin cancer. And they didn't have FDA clearance. They didn't have anything to really back the implication of what they were putting on the App Store, and the FDA shut them down. And this is happening more and more, where it's actually the FTC that's stepping in and saying you're misleading consumers by the statements that you're making about your AI or your AI. There's a lot more out there. And there's a lot of, I'm sure that this class is very aware of all the frameworks, the coalitions, the proposals for best practices. Like if you go to the literature and you search like AI ethics, you're gonna get like reviews of reviews. There's so much out there, and it's really hard sometimes to navigate. I think there's a lot of really cool stuff coming that's doing a better job of trying to consolidate everybody. But what we like to talk about from a regulatory perspective when we're advising our folks is, well, we want to be aware of all those things, and we want to try to simplify all those things that are out there. But we also want to be aware of what you have to do, right? Don't mess with the federal government. If the federal government is telling you to do something, start doing that as a basis or as a starting point, and build from there. So that's a lot of where our advice comes from is, okay, let's look at exactly what the federal government is defining right now and use that to identify the type of activities that we need to make sure that we're accounting for in processes. Okay. Any questions on that last topic, or any additions or other stuff that you're aware of? Feel free to jump in or throw it in the chat. But I'll go into one more topic, a bonus topic for accountability and liability. And I'll give the caveat that actually some of this is my own thinking. Right now, this is very much an evolving space. Right now, especially given the fact that most AI out there is framed up to be clinical decision support. The actual legal obligations are often falling onto the final decision maker, which in many cases is the hospital or the physician. So building lots of clinical decision support tools, all those contracts will say something in there like, we're not responsible for the ultimate decision, that's all on you. And then if it ever went to court, it's likely that it would fall again on that final decision maker who's just augmented by these algorithms. But I also see that shifting. I see there being more accountability and potential liability on the diverse players in the whole life cycle of AI. So that's, some of this is forecasting a little bit, my own opinion. Some of this is based in reality, but I'll share it anyway. So I kind of see three big actors in terms of liability and accountability. These aren't the only actors in the whole system, right? We have patients, we have other things, but in terms of like who might ultimately be responsible or accountable for a clinical decision made or based off of AI, really the developers or the manufacturers play a significant role. The healthcare organization itself plays a significant role, right? They're the ones purchasing or utilizing or deploying these solutions in their clinic or hospital. And then we have our physicians, of course, who are often identified as the final decision maker. Really, the standards, regulations, and I should add contracting really help ultimately define who's liable and accountable. But the main takeaway for me, and this is where it gets a little bit anticipatory, is we need to do a really good job of identifying what party is best positioned to take on liability or take on accountability for each part of the AI lifecycle, right? Physicians can't do it all, but developers can't do it all either, right? We need to really break that all down and identify based off, this is something that needs to be done. Now, who's best positioned to take liability or accountability for it? And I'll walk through a quick example related to just one of those things, right? Everyone agrees we need transparency. Now, who's responsible for ensuring transparency? Let's walk through what the current guidance and or proposed rules are now saying right now in terms of who's responsible or who's, we could add liable, but really let's just stick with accountability because liability is more complex in the legal space. But who's accountable for transparency? So I'm going to talk about three different federal agencies. One is the FDA, who's more focused on really the manufacturer obligations, the developer. Those are building the AI. We also have another agency, the Office of the National Coordinator, and they're responsible for health IT certification, right? So they're the ones as an agency that would be responsible for like certifying Epic, use of Epic. And then we have another agency that actually governs HIPAA, the Office of Civil Rights, or OCR, who are really kind of looking more at like what are the obligations and the responsibilities of the covered entity, hospitals, the physicians. So now thinking back to that wheel, these kind of represent each of those pieces to a degree, right? We have our developers, we have our hospital systems, right, like or the healthcare delivery tools that are being used, and then we have our physicians, or we have the final decision maker. And here's some of the rules that are coming out related to transparency. So first of all, the manufacturer, the FDA. So remember that criteria 4, if you remember from way back in my earlier slides, they were expecting really what we call that category really is more about transparency, right? Delivering the information that allow a physician to actually make their own independent basis for the decision. So the FDA would say in their guidance, if you want to be a non-medical device, you have to provide that information. You have to provide transparency for the physician or the user to independently review and make their own clinical judgment, their own basis for their final recommendation. Now, if you don't meet that criteria, then you're likely a medical device, if you meet the definition of a medical device, in which case you're going to go through the FDA and you're going to have transparency by nature of going through the FDA, all that other stuff that I showed with the FDA process. So basically the FDA is saying you have to have transparency as a manufacturer. So I think that's a safe, fair rule. Then we've got the Office of National Coordinator, ONC, who has just recently come out with their own proposed rules on transparency. And they're basically saying if you're a health IT system, you need transparency too. So now we kind of like, this is kind of working a little bit, right? We've got the manufacturers who have to create that information about their products. And we have the health IT certification bodies that are saying, okay, Epic, you actually have to deliver that information. And you have to make sure that users see that information. You can't just wall it off and provide only the output. Great, now here's a scary one for you. I don't know where this rule is going. It may still be close to passing as a final rule, but we'll see. We have the Office of Civil Rights, OCR. Their approach, again, with oversight over the covered entities, the physicians, is they actually said that covered entities should be liable for decisions made in reliance on AI, even if they did not design the algorithm or have knowledge of how it works. That's kind of scary, right? Like if you're thinking about where AI is going, where technology is going, physician using an AI product and maybe using it in their clinical decision making or even relying on it, if that AI output ends up being biased or wrong, physician would be liable for that output. That creates a really tense and difficult scenario for use of AI in clinical practice by making the decision maker, the physician, liable. But I want to actually take a step back and then look at this with a different light, right? If this rule existed in isolation, really scary, right? Because physician is like, how can I do any AI in clinical practice when I'm always going to be liable? What's the value of using these tools if I can't actually use them without being liable for the decision? However, if you look at that same rule in alignment with all these other ones, manufacturer needs to produce information about the product, health IT needs to deliver information, then I have, by rule, by federal rules, I have to have the information to independently make a basis for my determination. Then it makes a little more sense that for a clinical decision support application, a physician would be able to have the information needed to actually reasonably take accountability for that decision. And if they don't have that information, such as in cases where maybe that algorithm is actually intended to be relied upon, then they can go back and they can negotiate a contract and say, for example, I think that you should be liable because your advertising materials are telling me to rely upon it, and you should take liability. Which, by the way, the company that I previously worked for, we did do that. The output of our AI, we by contract took liability for the output of that product. So if it was relied upon and it was harm to a patient, we would be responsible as the manufacturer. So there is some precedent for that.
Could I ask a question here? So
yeah,
the covered entity includes the healthcare organization as well, too. And is there any differentiation here or any consideration of that? I guess coming from Office of Civil Rights.
Yeah, and it really is intended for the healthcare entity. So I put it on that diagram as physician, kind of like as ultimate user decision maker, but actually the more likely legal scenario would be accusation against the healthcare organization as the covered entity, which would handle it. Yeah.
Got it. Thank
but
you.
It kind of in law, right? They're going to always implicate everybody who's involved in the including physician.
Yep.
That's a good point. That's a good comment. Thank you.
Can I also ask a quick question? So yeah. For the last items you mentioned, so in case there's a long trains of AI, so one product is dependent on another product, which is powered by AI. In that case, what's going to happen in this kind of situation? Are we still saying, okay, the covered entity should take responsibility for that product? Because I imagine in the future of the world, everything is connected, right? And at some point, you're probably going to be powered by AI.
Yeah, that's such a great question, and we really don't know where that's going. And I know from the FDA perspective, they're very modular, right? They're going to look only at the one function in their governance, right? And expecting accountability, which would potentially lead to liability. But when you start getting to where I just went with like step by step, infinitely complex ecosystem. So we're probably just going to get to where we typically are in court cases, where we break it all down. We look at who was positioned to do each decision making and where it went wrong, and then go find that party. But it's going to be, you're right. AI is very complex, so it's going to be really messy. Great question. Yeah, good question.
I also have a question. I guess, can you give us, maybe an example of like a situation where a healthcare provider might prefer to use one of these medical devices? Because if they're going to be liable anyways, like supposedly like the device should make their life easier, but I don't have a concrete example right now in my head of what that might look like.
Yeah, and that's a proposed rule. So I think, probably most physicians right now are potentially even unaware of that rule or not really thinking as much about it, or honestly just thinking like, well, I'm okay. Like I know how to make my own clinical judgment. Most of the value would come into play on in what I see in the field right now is just time savings, right? Getting rid of or significantly reducing monotonous, detailed tasks that just inundate that physicians are inundated with new technology. A lot of that kind of stuff where they're saying like, boy, I can save 8 minutes per patient on this with this AI, and I can save 30 minutes per week on summarizing this with this AI, and I do like pretty soon like that burden that's on physicians is alleviated. So that's the majority of where I think the solutions are right now. And with those kinds of things, they're probably not too worried about AI. I think the higher risk stuff is going to come into play when it's like actually like driving more towards clinical diagnostic and decision making, which some still see a lot of value in, right? Like, hey, it actually reviewed my radiology image and made sure that I caught that lesion that I wouldn't have otherwise maybe caught. So it's sort of like this mitigation. Yeah, great question. Another question.
Yeah, so one question I had was circling back to something you mentioned at the start with your liability chart of how there are three different general, like large categories of actors. I wonder how much of that framework is informed by what patients feel in terms of like their personalized approach to getting medical care, since let's say the healthcare provider for patient A versus patient B can differ really drastically, not just in terms of what they might cover and subsidize, but also in terms of how a patient may just take the information from a trustworthiness standpoint from their healthcare provider versus the physician or clinician that they're talking to. So I'm wondering how much of like the accountability and liability that you've talked about needs to be like personalized, or how much effort there should be in personalizing it.
Yeah. And I think this is such we're at such an early stage of evolving that I don't know exactly where it's going to go. And that those three actors in this, that's sort of my own thinking. But I will, to your point, and this is like a Mayo Clinic thing, right? Where our whole core value, our principal pillar is the needs of the patient come first. To me, that accountability, liability is to ensure that we have protection for patients, right? And I think that what we currently have is a little scary because I feel like there's a lot of finger pointing, right? Oh, it was all in the developer, it was all in this. Oh, if I didn't have the information, and I feel like that's the risk to patients that I see right now, given our early stage. And I think that what we want to evolve to for the benefit of the patients is that like for each area of potential risk to that patient, we actually do have multi-functional accountability throughout the chain for the protection of patients so that they can say, hey, I was harmed. I don't know why or how, but we can look back at the record and actually find the right party that should be responsible for having prevented that harm so that didn't occur in the first place, or that they can compensate to make that person whole again. I'm not sure if I totally answered the question, but I think that it has to have a patient orientation to it when we're thinking about accountability, because they're the ones who are harmed and should have a really quick pathway to identify who's
No,
responsible.
yeah, that definitely does. Like it should be
Cool.
tailored towards optimizing their experience of giving that input and then providing them with the next steps in a way that's
Yeah,
explainable and suited towards them. So yeah, thank you so much for that
yeah,
explanation.
of course. And that's why I didn't put them in the wheel, right? Because it's for them, not like they're never going to be liable if they're subject to it. But yeah, great question.
I want to just quickly now acknowledge that we're at 2, so if people need to drop off, please feel free to. David, I don't know if you have a couple minutes if there's other lingering questions. If not, I'm happy to share your email if that's okay with you. Maybe
Yeah,
people
no,
can
that
get
would be
that to
great.
you there.
Yeah, happy to.
Awesome.
And thank you all. This is fun.
Thank you so much. And I'm so glad we were able to have like a real discussion here. So thank you so much for facilitating this and sharing all this with us.
Yeah, my pleasure. Good luck to y'all. Thanks for having me join.
Thank you. Take care. Bye, everyone.
Take care.